Welcome on in, everyone. Thank you for joining us here on NJ.com. I'm with Adam Clark. My name is Joe Giglio, and we're talking here today about a story that has had many layers, a story that was dug up from years ago, and unfortunately looks like it's going to be a sad ending, maybe some justice. But Jimmy Snuka, a professional wrestler way back in the day, old school wrestling fans remember him. He's been charged with third-degree murder here, and today we have Adam Clark with us. He is an education reporter for NJ Advanced Media. A few years ago, he worked for the Morning Call up in the Allentown area of Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, and and uncovered a story, really rehashed a story that all the way back in the 80s. So that was part of why Jimmy Snuka was charged yesterday with third-degree murder. Adam's with us now to tell us a little bit about his reporting and how this whole story came about. Adam, thanks for hopping on here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Joe.
So take us into your reporting, your investigation. Jimmy Snuka yesterday charged up in the Lehigh Valley, third-degree murder back from the early 80s. With a then girlfriend of his who died in a motel or died in the hospital, but the injury suffered somewhere probably in a hotel room in around Whitehall Township. So you were there in Pennsylvania a couple years ago reporting on this. How did you find out, kind of the details of what happened so long ago?
Yeah, this really for me goes back to early 2011. At the time I was covering school board meetings and town hall meetings in the Lehigh Valley region. And one of the editors at the Morning Call was a big wrestling fan back in the 80s. He watched Snuka and Roddy Piper and all of those guys. And so he happened to be reading online about Snuka and saw that he had a girlfriend who died in Allentown back in 1983. And he said this will be a really good cold case story because the paper was doing a series on cold cases at the time. So I volunteered because I thought it would be a cool story to work on. I thought it was really compelling. And from that point, really for about 2 years, worked kind of on and off again on the story, trying to really track down any documents that we could find, anybody who was involved in the case at all. And it ended up, as we've seen, being a really, really interesting story.
Yeah, it certainly is. And it's unfortunate, the details of it. And as I was reading through some of what we've had on NJ.com the last couple of days and kind of going back to what we knew back in the day, some of your story, and then now, the part that jumped out to me is how many different stories it seems Jimmy Snuka has given over the years to what had happened to this woman who was his girlfriend. Head trauma was the cause of death, but it seemed like over the years Jimmy Snuka was giving a whole bunch of different reasons on how maybe she hurt her head there.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I found. And the autopsy report, that was something that the coroner's office there in Lehigh County was not going to release to us. The district attorney's office said, it's still technically an open case. We're not going to give that to you. And the Whitehall Police Department said that all of their files were in storage somewhere and no one had really looked at them in years. So in order to get all of that, we actually had to go to the Federal Archives warehouse in Philadelphia, which is where the 1985 lawsuit that the Argentino family had filed against Snuka has been sitting there in storage for, I guess I was 28 years at the time when I went back and looked at it. So as I'm paging through that, I realized there are 5 different people from the hospital, I think 4 different people from the hospital, 1 police officer, who all had a story from Snuka about Jimmy either pushing or shoving Nancy, and then Nancy falling down and hitting her head. Each of those were a little bit different, but they all centered around the fact that he somehow caused her to fall. Then when he did his interview with police, he started talking more about how she slipped and fell alongside the road. And that's the story that he primarily told, different versions of that story up until just recently in his autobiography and even in radio interviews, although the stories sometimes did have some different details. I think he mentioned once that there was a creek nearby, and that's a detail that had not been in any of the previous versions. So it is interesting. I mean, some of that could just be his memory in the later interviews, but the story distinctly changed when he did his official interview with police.
So, Adam, you mentioned his memory here, and he's in his 70s now, I believe 72 years old, and he also recently was diagnosed with stomach cancer. So Jimmy's not in a good way right now physically. Where is this now? I mean, where will this case go? He's been charged with third-degree murder, but we're so many years removed. He is ill at this point. That's why I believe that the Lehigh County allowed him to be post-jail, because usually in these kind of cases, I don't think the bail is given as quickly as it was for him. He's out of jail right now. He posted bail. But where do you think this goes next, just because of his age and his medical condition?
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I think I'm just as interested as everyone else probably is to see exactly how this pans out. I'm also interested to see how the DA's office was able to put this case yesterday of new witnesses coming forward. So it's possible that somebody came forward with something that they were sitting on for 30 years that really helped break the case open. But we won't know that for sure, I guess, until the legal proceedings start and we find out exactly what Jim Martin and the DA's office has.
You mentioned earlier, a few minutes ago, that your editor up there at the Morning Call, when you story, he was a big old school wrestling fan. I am too, and then was. And yesterday, when this story first started to break out, that he was being charged with murder here, a couple of my friends texted me and said, can you believe this story about Jimmy Snuka? And I remember hearing about it, but then this rehashed all the details here. And I think there are a sentiment of people who wonder, was any of this maybe pushed aside or not investigated to its fullest back in the day? Because Jimmy Snuka was a big deal. He was a star in major sports entertainment at the time. When you were going through and researching and doing your story, did any of that come up, that maybe not every rock was turned over because of who it was and what he was?
I mean, based on the police reports, there's no real evidence of that. From what we saw, we do know that Vince McMahon cooperated from everything that we were able to dig up. We know that some at the time, I believe Mr. Fuji and Don Morocco were interviewed, and I believe Buddy Rogers, is that the name of Snuka's manager?
I believe so.
He was also someone who by the accounts that I read in the police files, was cooperative with it. So it didn't seem as though there was an intent on that part to try to not cooperate or cover anything up. But we don't know what was going through the mind of the prosecutors at the time. But I do know Jim Martin said yesterday that he feels confident that Snuka's celebrity status did not play a role in their not being charged at the time.
Adam Clark is with us here. He covers education for New Jersey Advanced Media. He worked a few years ago for the Allentown Morning Call, and he wrote a story on Jimmy Snuka, kind of rehashing what had happened way back in the early 80s with Jimmy and the death of a then-girlfriend of his back in the early 80s, and now Jimmy Snuka being charged with third-degree murder. So, Adam, when you were working on the story, was there a moment where you kind of had enough research and enough information where you started to say, there really might have been something here they missed? Or did you ever think that they would get here a few years later where, we'd be having this conversation, you'd be on the Today Show today? Did you think we'd get here based on when you were writing that story?
It wasn't something that really crossed my mind much. As I was putting the story together, the goal was really to bring this story kind of back to life for our readers in Allentown who maybe had never heard of this before or completely forgotten about it, because the case at the time didn't get a ton of local coverage there. Snuka was not from Allentown. Nancy Argentina was not from Allentown. The WWF was still kind of on the cusp of becoming what it is today. So that's really what we were thinking about. And even when the story ran, it wasn't really a thought of mine that Jimmy Snuka would be charged. Not until yesterday, when I heard there was going to be a news conference, that was the first time where I really thought, okay, this is actually happening.
Yeah, and it is happening. And Jimmy Snuka here is going to have to go through the proceedings. Now, in the mid-'80s, a couple years later, he was forced to pay a settlement, I believe, and maybe he never paid that. So there was another layer to this, even though he wasn't charged with murder. Am I correct about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the family had filed a wrongful death lawsuit back in 1985. And according to all the records that I looked through, basically Snuka said that he couldn't pay to defend himself, and so he lost the case by default. And for what the family says, there's no evidence that he ever paid any money.
Right, he didn't pay the money, and now that's kind of another layer to all of this. So you mentioned the family and the sisters of the woman that was murdered, and her mother, I believe, as well, is still alive. And I think that adds a layer to this, because it's not usually when you have a case so many years removed, maybe there aren't many witnesses or friends or family around to lay some context to all of this. But in this case, you have that. I mean, her sisters are still with us. I think that adds to it.
Yeah, and I just heard from one of the sisters earlier today, and I'm probably going to have a conversation with her this afternoon and check in with her about, how the family is reacting to this. I know yesterday they were quoted as saying that it was a relief for the family after all of this time to kindly feel that they have maybe a little bit of closure or know that this was really thoroughly investigated, because the family had questions before. They felt as though maybe it had been pushed aside.
Yeah, and certainly, and there was a story on our site this morning on NJ.com. Randy Miller, who covers sports for us here, he had a story about kind of his role in all this. A couple years ago, he interviewed Jimmy Snuka in the Phillies dugout, and then he kind of did his own little research on this same thing we're talking about now, and he talked to one of the sisters, and apparently there had been other incidents between Jimmy Snuka and the woman who was eventually murdered, physical incidents where, who knows exactly what happened, but this might have not been the first time that he got physical with her in an abusive way, and it might have led to something here. So I think that adds to it too, that this wasn't maybe an isolated incident with Snuka and this woman.
Yeah, and there was a case, I don't remember exactly how long it was before. It was at least a couple months before the case in Allentown. It was at a hotel in New York where police were called because a woman was screaming, I believe, and it was Nancy. And the police came and they arrested Jimmy. But at the time, Nancy then said that Jimmy did not hit her, never hit her. She signed in a sworn affidavit saying that, and he was not charged. And he did issue a public apology at a wrestling match up in New York for his kind of brawl, I guess, that he had with the police officers. But that was basically the extent of that one.
Right. So, I mean, here we are with Jimmy Snuka being charged, third-degree murder. If you're just hopping on, Adam Clark is with us. He wrote about this story a couple of years ago up for the morning call in the Lehigh Valley area. And yesterday, the prosecutors up there did charge Jimmy Snuka, the former WWF star, now it's WWE, but WWF star, with third-degree murder. He's 72 years old. So for you, Adam, I mean, what questions do you have? And what's kind of going through your head as someone who played, a role in this? I mean, I don't think you knew it at the time, but yesterday they did reference your story. So that had to probably feel good as a journalist, but probably also other emotions going through your head at this time.
Yeah, it's been kind of overwhelming. A lot going on with this story, and I think the big question for me really is what happened from the time our story ran until the grand jury investigation and until yesterday, in terms of what evidence did they find that was maybe new? What did they maybe look at from a different lens than the prosecutors did 30 years ago? And really how they were able to put this case together. Because obviously back in 1983, the DA's office didn't feel that they had enough. And now here in 2015, they do think there's enough for charges. So what happened? Hopefully we will find out. But as of now, I think it's still unclear exactly what they have and how they're going to pin these charges against him moving forward.
Definitely. It's going to be a story that we're going to follow here and probably follow really closely. The one thing that I think of, and Adam, as someone who is a journalist in this day and age, you could probably speak on this. The one thing I wonder is, and just considering how big sports entertainment is now and the coverage we have of it, if something like this happened today, it's hard for me to believe that it would just go away for a long time and then it would come back. I mean, it's impossible to know because who knows what the evidence was in the DA office at the time. But I feel like if this happened with a professional wrestler in the WWE today, there's no way it would go dormant for as long as it did. Do you agree?
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, we didn't have social media back then, and the internet and everything that we have now. And really, this story lived on primarily kind of in that underground wrestling newsletter community. And there was a reporter named Irv Muchnick who wrote about it. I guess in the early 2000s or maybe in the 90s, he wrote about it. And so that was kind of the one account that was out there was his story. And that was kind of a pathway for us to know about the lawsuit and then start to piece it together and dig even deeper.
I used to read his newsletter because I was a big wrestling fan. I thought it would come full circle here and we'd be talking about him today. But he did some good, obviously, because this all came to fruition. Adam, we really appreciate you hopping on. I know it's been a busy day for you. Today's show. You're busy, doing your normal reporting and all this. So we appreciate a few minutes to give us insight from someone who played a role in this. And if any other layers come out, maybe we'll do this again and we'll talk about it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks, everyone, for watching here on NJ.com.